Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. The legend of Roanoke Colony. In August 1587, a group of English settlers arrived at the remote island of Roanoke, located in North Carolina. They were part of an expedition aimed at securing English presence in the New World. Time passed, and when their leader, John White, returned to England for supplies, the settlement was left under the leadership of his fellow countrymen. When he returned 3 years later, in 1590, Roanoke was deserted, and all the inhabitants had vanished without a trace. During his search, John White came across the only clue. The word Croton was carved into a large tree. However, even today, no historian, archaeologist, or researcher has been able to explain what happened to the settlers or why their disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in North American history. Since then, the Roanoke settlement became a legend that continued to frighten locals and travelers who ventured into this part of the world. The story of the settlement's disappearance was shrouded in dark mists and mystical tales. Some said the settlers were consumed by the dark forces of the forest, others claimed they fell victim to a terrible disease. But the most frightening theory was that they were taken from another world, and this world was never meant to know of their existence. In June 1687, when a strong storm hit Roanoke, a small group of explorers set out for the island to uncover its mysteries. Among them was a young geographer, James Bennett, who sought to unravel this ancient enigma. His relatives believed in magic and dark forces, but James was a skeptic, and he joined the other scholars in search of answers to his questions. The island, though surrounded by the incredible beauty of nature, was one of the most dangerous places to be found on the east coast of America. The first thing that surprised the team was the mysterious calm that enveloped the island. Not a single bird sang, the trees did not stir, and even the waves did not crash against the shore. Only a dense fog obscured their vision, adding even more fear to the atmosphere. The team ventured deeper into the island, where old maps indicated the area where the Roanoke settlement once stood. And there, under the fog, they found something that seemed almost impossible. All the ancient wooden structures, remnants of huts, and even a few signs of human activity were well preserved, but there was not a soul in sight. The first unpleasant sign came when one of the women, the researcher Alice, said she had heard a quiet whisper from the forest. Everyone tried to calm her, considering it just a hallucination from exhaustion, but the whisper grew louder. It became more and more distinct. James tried to locate the source of the sound, but his vision grew increasingly lost in the thick fog. They decided to split up to search for more signs. But each time the group returned to the meeting point, something was wrong. Their number had decreased. One of the expedition members, the elderly archaeologist Henry, vanished without a trace, though he left his belongings behind. He had left a strange note in his journal, mentioning that he sees their eyes, they are watching him. The other members began to panic, but the worst was yet to come. One evening, when night fell upon the island, it seemed nothing could be more terrifying. But when the researchers finally gathered in an old hut to discuss their next steps, they heard voices. They sounded like whispers, but they were so real that there was no doubt. Someone or something was nearby. James again approached the window and saw something horrific. Figures of people standing in the forest. They were dressed in strange, ancient clothes, and their eyes glowed with a dead fire. And then James understood. These were the souls of the people of Roanoke, who had become part of this place. They could not leave, and their souls were bound to the island. However, the most terrifying part was that for every person who entered the island, one of these souls sought to take them. The researchers began to flee, but invisible threads already enveloped the island, keeping them in its grasp. They could not find their way back, and every step brought them closer to an inevitable fate. Only James remained sober and calm, recalling the carved word, Croton, on the tree he had seen at the very beginning. He realized that it was not just a clue. It was a curse that indicated the island and everyone who found themselves there would remain part of its dark power. James began to speculate on how it was possible for these people to have disappeared and why they left that word. He concluded that they had made a pact with something very old and powerful for protection, but in exchange, their souls had become part of that terrible force. He felt that it was already too late, and he could not avoid the same fate. A few hours later, when rivers of blood no longer seemed so unreal to him, James saw an old tree on the horizon with the word Croton carved into it. He walked to it and sat, trying to understand if he would ever escape this hell. And even today, on Roanoke, those who dare to enter hear the whisper of the wind carrying the curse, and the strange eyes watching them from the fog. James sat by the tree, feeling his heart beat in rhythm with every stir of the breeze that drifted from the forest. The entire atmosphere of the island seemed filled with hostility and darkness, as if every inch of the land was soaked with an impenetrable force that unwittingly pulled him toward it. He tried to collect his thoughts, but the constant whispering from the forest unsettled him. These were voices. Many voices, softly murmuring in the darkness. James couldn't distinguish them, but he knew for sure they were not just winds. These were the voices of the former inhabitants of Roanoke, who had once been taken by the island's power and now remained forever a part of its shadow. He rose to his feet, trying to shake off the fear, but something in his heart told him he should not leave this tree. His gaze shifted downward, and he noticed another detail. Beside the tree on the ground lay an ancient stone, covered with strange symbols that he could not decipher. They resembled ancient runes that seemed familiar, but he had never encountered them before. James felt that this might be the key to unraveling the mystery. Then, in the darkness, a new nightmare began. Just a few steps away, at the very edge of his vision, the first figure appeared. A man in ancient clothing. His face was pale and hunched, his eyes deep black pits. He slowly approached, and James felt something cold and heavy grip his soul. The man seemed not to notice James. His movements were mechanical, like a puppet slowly advancing toward the tree, and with each step, his face became more ordinary. The feeling that this was not a human being grew clearer. But suddenly, the figure stopped and turned to face him. James saw its eyes. Empty, devoid of light. They glowed ominously like two black voids, and he felt cold sweat running down his spine. "Are you seeking answers, James?" A voice echoed, and James instantly recognized the same whispers that had tormented him. The voice was muffled, as if coming from deep within the earth, from hell itself. "Who are you?" James asked, though he understood it no longer mattered. He knew he was no longer in this world. "I was one of them. Those who tried to escape, who refused the deal. I am one of the first to become part of this place," the man replied, and his face became blurry, like the fog that once again enveloped the island. "Do you want to understand why they all disappeared?" He continued, moving closer to James, who felt an invisible force holding him in place. "Everything that happened is part of a great deal. But it's not a deal that can be broken." At that moment, James realized that there would be no way back for him. He had become part of this mystery, and even if he managed to escape, he would forever remain with them, in this world and the one beyond it. "Lost souls who live here, we have become part of the island. And you will become part of it too, James." Like all those who settled here, the voice was calm, but a heavy truth fell upon James, one that weighed more than death itself. Meanwhile, his friends with whom he had once traveled were already far away. Some may have fled, while others became part of this terrible and endless game. Their eyes vanished into the darkness, and their screams merged with the whispering forest. James, unable to resist, fell to his knees before the tree and placed his hands on the ancient stone. It was the moment when he understood that the deal had already been made long ago, and that he would not find his way back. The fog swallowed him, and with every step he took in the darkness, he felt his own body growing heavier. The souls surrounding him became a part of him, and he was no longer just a human. James became a part of the Roanoke legend, and from that moment on, his name was forgotten among the countless shadows that roam the island. And today, when tourists and adventurers approach Roanoke, they hear whispers echoing from deep within the forest. They might see a faint light on the horizon, which could be fog or invisible figures watching them, waiting to take them. And even if they find the word Croton, they will never be able to escape, for it was truly a curse that will never allow them to forget this island. Time had no power over Roanoke Island. Days and nights blended into one endless loop, and even those who arrived on the island hoping to unravel its mystery became part of this cycle. Few remembered James' name, but his presence was always felt, in the whispers, in the fog, in the dark eyes watching from the forest. Years passed, and new researchers, often bold and impatient, tried again and again to penetrate this place. They came with maps, scientific instruments, and belief in logic and rationality. But what awaited them on the island defied all the laws of nature. One morning, as a strong wind brought a fresh batch of cold fog from the ocean, two more researchers arrived on Roanoke, Martha and Robert. They were specialists in paranormal phenomena, known for their ability to sense invisible forces. They were among the few who weren't afraid of the stories of disappearances, but instead sought to understand what had really happened to Roanoke. They brought with them modern technologies, cameras, sensors, and special devices meant to detect anomalous energy fields. They headed for the center of the island, where, according to the locals, everything had begun, where the Roanoke settlement once stood. The first few days passed relatively calmly. They didn't find any obvious anomalies, and Martha began to doubt whether this place was truly as mysterious as everyone said. They heard no whispers, saw nothing unusual. But on the fourth day, strange events began to unfold that defied all logical explanations. At night, after Robert had started recording his latest observations, they heard the first odd sounds. These were footsteps, coming from beneath the trees. Dull, slow, as if something heavy was being dragged along the ground. At first, they thought it was a wild animal, but when they both turned around, there was no one to be seen. The next morning, they found strange flashes on their cameras that couldn't be explained by their equipment. They considered it an anomaly, but with each hour of reviewing the footage, they began to feel more and more that something was wrong. Later that day, they found the stone. The very same one that James had once held. It was discovered deep in the forest, hidden among the dense trees. It was located in the same spot where, at the beginning of their research, there seemed to be no stone at all. Robert tried to lift it, but as soon as his hand touched the stone, one of the sensors on their equipment began to emit a strange humming sound. This happened simultaneously with another mysterious flash on the camera. At that same moment, Martha felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She turned around and noticed something in the darkness that had always been on the edge of her perception. Eyes. It was as if the forest itself was watching them. Only when they began to retreat did it become clear that they were being observed by hundreds of invisible figures. Their faces turned pale, and Martha took a few steps back, clutching the stone. All their research and hypotheses seemed meaningless. What they were feeling was real and merciless. The forest, the dark figures, the whispers that were growing louder, no longer seemed like something scientific. They felt it in their bones. The island was alive, and it didn't want to let them go. Had they continued their research, they would have become the next ones. If they had left the stone, the island would have quietly sunk back into the fog, hiding their traces from the rest of the world. They understood this in an instant, as a distant voice seemed to begin singing their names in rhythm with the wind. Martha looked at Robert, and in her eyes was the same realization. They had become part of this story. And even if they managed to escape, their souls would remain on this island, remembered only by those who came after them. Since then, no living foot has stepped on Roanoke, as the stories of the island became even more terrifying. And although scientists and researchers continued to arrive, just like James and others before them, nothing reached them from Roanoke except forgotten names and soulless eyes glistening in the fog. And it will always be this way. And only those who visit, hearing the word Croton, will truly understand that Roanoke Island is not just a place in history. It is a place where the mystery is not only unsolved but is forever preserved in the hearts of those who have ever become part of this story. Time passed, and with each year, the legend of Roanoke became increasingly tangled with horrifying details. The local villages on the mainland began to tell tales of the night whispers from the island growing louder. And not only the whispers, witnesses occasionally saw faintly illuminated figures wandering along the shores, and even seemed to find human footprints that suddenly vanished, leaving no other evidence behind. One autumn evening, when thick fog once again covered the island, a group of new researchers set off for Roanoke. These were bold, seemingly determined individuals, resolute to solve the mystery of the colony's disappearance. Among them was Jonathan, a leading archaeologist, and Laura, a psychologist specializing in paranormal phenomena. They knew about the previous disappearances, but they treated them as muddled stories blending fact with fiction. In reality, none of them were prepared for what they were about to experience. The island greeted them with an unnatural silence. The fog that covered the land like a silk cloth seemed alive, as if it were swallowing their steps. The nature around them was exceedingly gloomy. Trees looking centuries old, with black branches that resembled strong hands reaching toward the sky. The feeling that they were not alone came almost immediately after they stepped over the entrance line marked on the old maps. The deeper they moved into the island, the stronger the sensation grew that something invisible was following them, waking up and unfolding in the darkness. Laura felt it first. She couldn't explain why, but she became convinced in her mind that the island was alive. Her experience with paranormal phenomena allowed her to sense when a place was filled with entities that didn't belong to the human world. Her mental resilience began to waver. She turned to Jonathan, asking if he felt the same, but he just mockingly replied that she was prone to obsessive ideas. But when the first shadows appeared on the horizon, faintly illuminated figures moving among the trees, their humor dissolved, replaced by the cold sense of danger. Jonathan, initially skeptical, began to feel uneasy. This was not just fear. It was a feeling that could not be described in words. It was what he feared most. The realization that he had found himself in a place that had nothing to do with human understanding of time, space, and reality. The shadowy figures grew closer. They were dark and shapeless, their eyes glowing red like two merciless flames. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, the figures stood before him, their faces blurred by fog, yet still recognizable. These were the people who had disappeared from the Roanoke settlement, their faces slightly distorted, their bodies covered in dark marks. "Are you still searching?" One of them spoke. The voice was muffled, as if coming from some abyss, but it was the question that terrified Jonathan the most. He couldn't understand how these souls still had the ability to speak. "We are searching for the truth," Jonathan replied, though he wasn't entirely sure it was the right path. "The truth is here, Jonathan," another voice said. "But the truth is that we are you. You and we are one. And what you are searching for is leading you to us." It seemed as though the ground beneath their feet started to move, and the island itself began to feel alive. Jonathan tried to step back, but something invisible restricted his movements. Laura, already terrified, ran toward him, but she could no longer tell whether this was the real island or if they had entered some other reality. "You are with us. We have been waiting for you," the figure said, and now their faces became clearer, more distinct. Jonathan saw in their eyes the same thing that hundreds of people before him had seen: despair, consumed by the island. "You will never escape," the figure muttered. And as soon as those words left his lips, everything around them turned dark. The screams faded, and the island seemed to settle into a calm, but one that was terrifying, as though this darkness was part of a great mechanism that moves endlessly. Martha and Robert were likely the last to venture there, but for them, the island did not become a simple place of research either. Roanoke was no longer a place of disappearance. It was the very entity itself. And now its dark figures continued to fill the forest with their whispers, waiting for the next brave souls to repeat the same cycle. Months passed, and soon the next group of researchers set off for Roanoke. This time, it was a group of young people, a student expedition, full of enthusiasm and confidence that they could unravel the island's mystery, one that had eluded scientists and adventurers of past generations. They arrived with new methods, hoping to gather more evidence, take more precise measurements of the anomalies. However, they didn't know that their ambitions would become another chapter in this endless story. The young researchers arrived on the island at the very beginning of autumn, when everything around them resembled an old forgotten world. The leaves covering the ground were dark in color, and the sky was covered with gray clouds. The fog, as before, surrounded the island, dense and heavy, as if it were trying to consume everything that approached it. When they set foot on Roanoke's land, one of them, Andre, looked back, and his heart grew heavy. It felt as though something was watching them from every tree, from every bush. And among the trees, which stood as silently as in the previous years, there was something strange. An unexplainable feeling that everything around them could move and pull them into its shadows. Andre began to doubt whether they should have come. But it was already too late. They ventured deeper into the island, trying to find what had once vanished along with the settlers. They set up their equipment, began collecting soil and plant samples, and took measurements of the energy anomalies. But the longer they stayed on the island, the more they felt that they were being watched. With each new step deeper into the island, the surrounding nature became more hostile. And it seemed that the island itself didn't want them to find its secrets. A kind of barrier was felt in every tree, with every step that grew heavier and more indistinct. And with every rising sensation, they began to understand that something on this island wouldn't let them rest. Andre noticed it first. Right after they reached the spot where the settlement had once stood, he saw a word carved into the bark of one of the trees: Croton. A cold sweat ran down his skin. He remembered reading about it in books, from the story of the colony's disappearance, but he had never expected that this real word would remain here. He couldn't forget it, and it seemed to start troubling his mind. Is this just a coincidence? He asked quietly, trying to keep calm, but his voice was betrayingly tense. The other researchers gathered around the tree, and they all began to study the word, which had become an incomprehensible confirmation that what had happened here many years ago was no accident. But then strange things began to happen. At first, sounds resembling footsteps started coming from the forest, but every time they tried to get closer, the sounds would disappear. Now everyone could feel that everything around them seemed alive. The tree trunks, which had previously looked ordinary, now resembled figures. Their shadows grew, and it seemed they were moving in tandem with the group. Andre felt his heart beat faster. He tried to convince the others that they needed to leave the island, but one of the researchers, Ivan, had been watching his reaction and started laughing. "You're at it again? These ghost stories make no sense," he said, his laughter echoing in the deep silence. But as soon as Ivan turned away, his body seemed to freeze. The shadow in front of him started growing, and a figure emerged from the forest. It was tall, thin, and terrifying. The face of this figure was shapeless, only dark, deep cavities that resembled hollow pits. It was the same face that Jonathan had seen. Ivan, unable to comprehend what was happening, let out a scream, which immediately fell silent, and his body vanished into the fog. The group fell into panic. Laura and Andre started searching for Ivan, but they all understood that each step they took only led them deeper into this nightmarish labyrinth. The island, which had once seemed like just a place from history, had now become something alive, something that wanted to consume them. The fog enveloped them, and each of them began to feel how the island was changing their thoughts, making them feel like part of something ancient and sinister. They were no longer just researchers. They had become part of this dreadful reality, where every soul that entered here became part of what had once vanished. And now, when new victims arrive on this cursed island, they will only find shadows watching them from behind the trees. And when they search for an answer, they will understand. Roanoke doesn't give answers. It only devours everything living to preserve its eternal shadow. Crotone is no longer just a word. It is a place that we'll never forget. And now, even those who try to escape will forever remain a part of it. With each subsequent step, as the researchers ventured deeper into the forest, the island began to be ruled by the growing darkness. The fog wrapped around their bodies like a tight cocoon, and each of them was left with some kind of mark, invisible but palpable. Their thoughts became more and more indistinct, as if the island itself were manipulating their consciousness. The feeling of fear completely controlled their imagination, and each one felt their mind gradually slipping from their grasp. Andre tried to call the others to leave this cursed island, but his voice was swallowed by the sound of the wind, which now poured from the trees as if they were breathing. He noticed how Laura looked at him with an expression that seemed utterly empty. Her eyes were clouded with fear, but also something more, as if she herself had begun to become part of the island, her soul already feeling that connection. Despair overwhelmed Andre when he realized they would not escape. The island began to move around them, its wooden trunk seeming to draw closer. Everything grew more foggy and unpredictable. Meanwhile, they had approached the same place where the settlement had once stood. Here, among the old stones, they found new traces, resembling human footprints, but they looked oddly distorted, as though time itself was switching and changing these images. Laura approached one of the stones that stood at the very edge of the old settlement. There, in a crack, she saw another carved phrase, the same as on the tree, but this time the word was bigger. Not Crotone, but Crotone all. And then, in the heart of that place which was hidden from the world, they understood. This was not just about islands, not just about disappeared people. This place does not accept strangers. It offers no chance for return. The island is a trap, drawing more and more souls, leaving them no choice. Soon, the abyss spread with darkness. As soon as Andre tried to take a final step back, the ground beneath his feet began to crumble, and he felt a black vortex swirling around him. In that moment, he remembered the last words from the history. Never leave Roanoke, because Roanoke does not leave you. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. It was not just death. It was eternity, which the island had to absorb, like a great insatiable creature devouring all life, whose goal was to leave only a shadow. Laura and the rest of the group never reappeared. Their traces vanished, and with them, their names. The island grew quiet again, and soon new, unknown figures appeared in the darkness. They were neither alive nor fully dead. They belonged to this place. They were part of its endless cycle. Over the years, several more groups arrived, attempting to unravel this mystery. And each time, they disappeared, just like all those before them. Only their stories remained in forgotten notes, in the air that filled with the whisper of Crotone. And when new generations began searching for the truth about this cursed island, they would understand that the real truth was not about what happened to the people, but why this island refuses to release anyone who dares to become part of it. Roanoke Island was no longer just a place. It had become a symbol, constantly alive and pulsing, like a black hole that eternally consumes souls, without hope of salvation. And only the shadow that envelopes this place remained unshaken. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.